Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vincent Hribaran. I'm the director of IFRA-Nigeria. IFRA-Nigeria is a French public institution based at the University of Ibadan. We do research, we publish research, and we're very interested in everything published on Nigeria and West African countries in general. Today, I'm very happy to welcome this talk by our colleagues who have just published a special issue of a journal called Politique Africaine. For those who have never heard about Politique Africaine, it can happen. Obviously, it's one of the leading French journals on political science on Africa, basically. In this special issue, you will find very interesting articles, which I will upload straight away, actually, which you can find, which you will find very quickly in the chat. Articles, as I'm sure you know, which deal with the moral landscapes of drugs in Africa. As in every special issue in French journals, you have an introduction dealing with that. You know, that's what happens with French journals, and that's why we're going to hear a first 15-minute presentation by Dr. Corentin Cohen, who's currently based at Oxford. Then we're going to have Dr. Ricard from ISM in Paris, who's going to give the second paper, also 15 minutes. The third paper by Dr. Annie van Dirk from Leuven, who's going to give the third paper. And the last person would be Dr. Clanching from the University of Bristol, and Ini Doubleedged as well from the University of Bristol, together for the last and fourth paper. So I'm very happy to have this session with you. Corentin, Maxime, can you jump in? You next.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, IFRA, for hosting us, and thank you, Gernot and Corentin, for obviously organizing this special issue and also this event today. So I will present today my paper I wrote with Félix Kwame-Groji from Bouaké University in Ivory Coast. This paper is based on the field research that we undertook together, ethnographic field research we undertook together between 2017 and 2019. I was doing my PhD research on post-war vigilantism in Ivory Coast, and Felix was doing his research on the socio-religious aspect of criminality in a neighborhood of Abidjan called Abobo. So our research has been undertook in this borough of Abobo, which is the largest borough of Abidjan, with more than 1 million inhabitants. The context of this paper is that there was an economy of violence that was built in Abobo in the context of a social ghetto that was reinforced during the civil war of the 2000s. And this borough is dominated by gang leaders who are linked to the world of transport, of commuting transport, and they have links to a broader socio-political scene in the country. And in this context, smoke houses, which are the main drugs smoke houses, I will develop that, social institutions which are embedded in value chains which are within the local society. Here, the legitimacy of the smoke houses are negotiated and contested by a wide array of actors, such as local leaders, policemen, vigilance committees, and religious actors. And so what we are trying to show in this paper is that interdependency relationships built around the smoke houses in Abobo participate to the negotiation of social order. And this interdependency relationship are making, building configurations in the sense of Norbert Elias, within which the social order is negotiated by a diversity of actors. And through our observations, our interviews, we did more than 100 interviews for this paper. We are giving voice to a wide array of actors to understand basically the social logics of these interrelations around drugs. So first, what should be highlighted is that the smoke houses, or fumoirs in French, or in Nouchi, in Ivory Coast, Bofo, is a social institution in Abobo, in this neighborhood. And there is a deep historicity of social ghettos in Ivory Coast since the beginning of the social political crisis in the 1980s. The world of drugs is, I would say, built around very important and complex hierarchies. You have at the top the one who is called Babache, which is kind of usually a politician or a big man in Ivory Coast who will be able to bring a lot of good some kind of social algorithm. And they are very important to understand the interface between the community and the smoke houses. And so what we are trying to show in the paper is that, contrary to some perceptions that we can have, these smoke houses are a core element of the social world of drugs, is really integrated in the community. It's not just fringe elements, people on the margins who are actors in it. So the main drugs are exchanged and consumed in these smoke houses are cannabis, opioids such as Traumadol, Rivotril, or diazepam, crack cocaine, and also to a lesser extent heroin injections. So the old fathers, the vieux pères in French, involved in the social world, as well as the bolotigi, the manager of the smokehouse, rely on a world of bon petits, or good littles in English. I don't know how exactly to translate it, which started to be nicknamed microbes in the post-war era. And there was, they initiated some kind of moral panic in Ivory Coast, but also a security crisis locally in Abobo. So I will develop on that. And the security crisis comes from the building of an economy of violence during the years of crisis in Ivory Coast. Locally in Abobo, you have multiples bonhi, local gangs who are basically used by different actors to dominate the transport economy of minibuses. So maybe I will just show, try to share you a photo that I did. Sorry. Oh, we cannot share, do screen sharing, right? It's okay.
Okay, I can give you the time. Again, if you let me do it. Try it, please, now. Go for it.
All right, all good. So here you have the Abobo traffic cycle. So you can see that the importance of the economy of transport here in Abobo. And this economy of violence is based basically on a very labile, unstable network of actors, political actors, religious actors, police, etc. And these interactions are sometimes competition, sometimes cooperation, and sometimes also a form of delegations. And beyond that, at the top of this economy of violence, you have union bosses. So if I can, yeah, you have union bosses. These union bosses are basically head of kind of mafias, and within it, drugs and the smoke houses are part of this, but it's not the only things they are doing and the only economies they are managing. What happened after the post-electoral crisis in Ivory Coast in 2010-2011 was that there was some kind of a security crisis where some of these union leaders were not happy with the peace dividends, if I may say, and they started to have a lot of infighting between them. And what happened basically is that, what I studied is that there have been the building of moral coercive communities, which basically organized, where local actors in the community were organized to fight crime. And so I studied the 6 vigilance committees during this research. And what was interesting that in my research, the smoke houses were really important to understand the social fabric. And so these vigilance committees were headed by local community leaders, youths that were linked to community leaders. And what was interesting too is that dealing with the smoke houses, we learned with Felix that basically beyond the coercive tactics that they use at the beginning to fight crime, we understood very quickly that they had to negotiate with these smoke houses, these borotigis, these managers of smoke houses, to maintain the social order locally. And what even more interesting, the police too, which on paper is fighting crime. So when I was doing my field research, every day you would have TV reports on the national TV about the fact that the police was destroying smoke houses and fighting, and so basically, in a sense, using the discourse of war on drugs that many of you know. And what was interesting is that locally, the police, the vigilance committees, the religious actors together negotiate the social order with the smoke houses. And so that's what we are trying to show in the paper. Maybe a last thing which I wish Felix could present today is that beyond these social interactions and social negotiations, meaning making is also done through magical religious relationships, and also the issue of success imaginaries. So within these configurations I have described, we are trying to show that magical religious relationships are very important. If I may share, so you can see here an example of a weapon that is used by gangs, and within it you have a talisman, a gris-gris, that is, so it's this weapon is supposed to have magical religious effects against your enemies. And on the other hand, you have also vigilance committees who are using also gris-gris or talisman to protect themselves, from the magical religious objects of the delinquents or drugs owners. And so basically, In the paper, we are trying to show that that the importance that the conflicts around drugs and the negotiation around drugs are also, in the negotiation of social order around drugs is also done on this level of the magical religious level. And so basically what is very, very important is also the role of marabout or fetishists. I hope it's a good translation in English. It's the first time I'm presenting this in English. And these marabout and fetishists are also part of this negotiation of social order, because delinquents, managers, and also those who work for the managers of smoke houses need also to negotiate their success, their social success, redistribute their success, and have the legitimacy given by marabout and fetishists. So it's a very, very important aspect to it. So to conclude, I would say that these configurations that we studied built around interdependency relationships are building the social order through coercive but also moral dimensions. And it allows to understand the moral landscapes of drugs in Abobo. These are also, we would say, collusive transactions, to take the expression of Johanna Siméon, the French sociologist, which are local, fragmented, and sectoral forms of legitimization. And so to speak, they are embedded in the social logics proper to the various social spheres of the societies and social fields. And so finally, through these negotiations, the practices in and around the smoke houses become permissible, even legitimate to a certain extent. And they are built on close social relations, but also on unstable and fluid relationships. And so to use the images of that Janet Rothman wrote about long back about the Lake Chad situation. These members of the social world are neither outlaw nor doing what is perceived as a moral activity, but their practices are rather a means of participating in actually the prevailing modes of accumulation and methods of governance within the Ivoirian society, in which everybody is supposed to be part of the emergence model, the post-war model of Alassane Ouattara. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime. Thanks a lot for that. Right in time as well. Thank you. So next paper with Fuya, Aniria, please.
Yes, thank you. Happy to be here today. Before I start, I want to say that this article is not written by me alone, but I wrote it with Roger Zerbo, who works at the CNRST in Ouagadougou. And I want to say a little bit about the context of how we got to write this article together, because I was in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, not for research on drugs actually, but my research was on mental illness for my PhD. But part of my PhD was an internship at INSS, where Roger worked at the time, and he was already working on this project related to drugs with a large group of people. It was quite a large project, trying not only to talk about what the article was about, our article was about in the end, but it was a project more directed to trying to make an estimation of how many drug users are in different cities in Ouagadougou, in Burkina Faso, and trying to learn about, also the comorbidities, the different illnesses that they might have alongside their drug use. So it was a much more general project. And within this project, there was a lot of testing basically going on, and then some people in each city were also selected to do an interview. So at the time I arrived in the project, the interviews were already done, and I got involved for the analysis of the interviews. So it was while analyzing these interviews that certain themes arose, and that's when we decided that we wanted to write an article about this together. So yeah, so I already explained a little bit about the larger research project. Yeah, so for this research project, they wanted to reach people who use drugs in Burkina Faso in different cities. So what they tried to do is to recruit people from the ghettos directly. The ghettos are the places where people generally go to smoke drugs or where they buy drugs. They used a respondent-driven sampling. So they really tried to start with people who already are part of these communities and let them recruit other people. And also the interviews conducted in this project were not conducted by researchers directly, but they were conducted by people who use drugs themselves, who were sort of from this community and already working for other organizations as sort of, yeah, mediateur is what their role is referred to, but yeah, so people who are already from the environment who might be able to establish a different kind of relation with the person being interviewed. But it also means, of course, that the data we had for the writing of our article is basically the transcripts of the interviews. So yeah, just to give a bit of context about the data. And I think the article and the argument we're trying to make is a bit of a reaction to a dominant public discourse in Ouagadougou, in Burkina, about drug use, which tends to, I think, criminalize people who use drugs and also very often associate drug use with mental illness, with madness, trying to, prevent people from starting to take drugs, which is a very, of course, important purpose, but also maybe sort of stigmatizing people who already use drugs. And another thing that's difficult, of course, is that it's hard also to find care for addiction if you would want to stop taking drugs. So yeah, that's a little bit of the context. I wish Roger was here today because he would know more, would be able to answer more questions about context later on, but I'll do my best. So the topic list of these interviews was actually not directed towards anything moral. It was directed to the histories of drug use, the substances consumed and the mode of consumption, knowledge and perceptions about the risks related to illness and risks related to social life. But as we were reading the interviews and at the same time, we were both interested in moral anthropology, also in relation to my own research, which basically tries to understand what people define as good or bad in relation to their own environment. And a central concept in moral anthropology is moral experience, which is understood as that part of experience that is shaped by individual and local ideas about what it means to be a good person, which can, of course, change over time because people age, and as they grow older, different things become important in life. So what we found in the interviews was a lot of moral reflection, actually, from people on their own situation, which, makes it not, yeah, so it's a bit of a, individual approach that we had to take. We don't know to what extent these reflections also are part of everyday interactions or outside the interview setting. And an important concept in moral anthropology is that of moral breakdown, which is actually the observation or the idea that moral experience or moral reflection is not always explicit, but it may become so when people are put in a situation that requires such reflection. And that, you know, being in a marginal situation, so for example, because people who use drugs are seen as living on sort of the margins of society, that this can actually incite moral reflection. But of course, in our case, it can also be that people started reflecting in this sense because of the interview setting, which was also a setting that took them out of their context. So 30 people were interviewed in Ouagadougou, 28 were men and 2 were women. And I forgot to say this in the beginning, but it's important that the project was specifically designed to learn more about people who use hard drugs. So mostly, and so in our sample, most of the people used heroin and some cocaine. And then most people actually mixed heroin with cannabis to smoke it. That was the way they usually consumed. So in these reflections that came up in the interviews, we kind of got a bit of a sense of how they actively reflect upon their own, the situation they are in, which is a situation that sort of puts them between drugs, using drugs, and society, you know, living up to societal norms. So the first thing that they mentioned a lot, which maybe makes a lot of sense, is, you know, that one of them said, we are not in the bodies of others. So when they started taking drugs, they said they didn't think about it too much. Most of them did it to do like others, or sometimes a few of them said, you know, I had worries, so I took drugs to forget my worries. But over time, their consumption had become more driven, not by the wish to consume, but more by the symptoms of not consuming, which they refer to as l'agence, la manque. So one of them also referred to this as the need to use drugs in order to be normal. But of course, their consumption had more consequences in their life, because using drugs and having to pay for drugs, of course, put you in a position where maybe you cannot, you know, organize your life as you would want to, or as other people would want to. So a second thing that almost everyone mentioned in the interviews was that they sort of felt the repercussions in their relationships. So a few mentioned that they felt they had socially declined because of drugs, because they were not able anymore to keep money or to make a lot of money. So they would say things like, you know, before I could buy my father a sheep for Tabaski, for the party, and now I cannot do it anymore. Or they would say things like, you know, my little brothers actually have risen above me in social status. And others also mentioned the inability to progress in life. So, for example, they would say, you know, in this situation, I cannot found a family, but I am now at the age that I should found a family. So, you know, the drugs, the problems had changed as they got older, and now they were like, well, maybe I should stop this, but they didn't know how to stop it. So this was often expressed as an inability to care for others. So at the same time, they said that, okay, that the fact that they needed these drugs all the time forced them to engage in bad behaviors, such as stealing, sort of creating a cycle where, you know, the social relations would further erode. So one of them said, you have to take it because you want to cure yourself. But he was also very conscious of the fact that this further stigmatized him in the eyes of others. And they also said, you know, I even stigmatized myself. I want to stay away from the people I love because I don't want to do them harm. So, so in their reflections, the use of drugs really emerged as sort of a double-edged sword. So they needed to take it in order to be normal. One man said, I have to take it, otherwise I cannot take care of anyone, because at least when I take drugs, I'm a little bit normal, I can work. At the same time, it was also a driver of social abnormality, because people would judge them for using drugs, or they would not have the means to take care of others because of the drugs. So in this situation, they had some different tactics that did not involve stopping drugs, because they saw it as an impossibility. But some of them said that they would use drugs itself as a coping mechanism to forget their worries, being fully aware that this wouldn't make their problem go away. While others, as already mentioned, said, you know, I decided to stay away from my family because I didn't want to do them any harm. And yet again, others said that they would turn to other people who use drugs actually to find a new community, or to find relations of solidarity that they couldn't find in their own environment, their family environment anymore. And last, well, there wasn't a lot of talk about the state and violence from the state, or in the interviews with people nevertheless mentioned that they didn't see any support coming from the state, and that they really felt put on the margins as well in that regard. So, so what does it show? I think what these interviews that we analyzed mainly show is that, you know, being a drug addict is not something that puts you completely out of society, but rather something that puts these people into a position where they sort of have to negotiate the norms of society while also having this addicted body that they do not see how to get rid of. And I think a very interesting thing to analyze would be, but I don't know, because in this program there was also rehabilitation offered. There was a detox clinic opened at the hospital, and then the people participated in this study were said, well, if you want, you can go have a treatment there. So it would be interesting to see if the people who expressed the wish to stop using, if it helped them. And also, I think it would be interesting to see if these kinds of reflections, if we use them in therapy, or if that could maybe mean something in the future to, yeah, sort of not put these people away as passive, or but more see how they already reflect on their situation and how we can actually build from there in the future in research as well. So, thank you.
Thank you, Annette. Thanks a lot. Exactly 15 minutes. Perfect. Genos, please.
Thanks a lot. I'm just gonna share my screen if possible, and I might not be so good with timekeeping, so please really just shut me up at the end, because I realize we are a bit behind schedule maybe. So can you see my screen, or?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, just try to get this to see. So so just first of all, thanks a lot, Vincent and Juliette and IFRA for inviting me and all of us to talk about that special issue today. This paper that I'm presenting is written together with Ini Doubleedged, who is also in the room, who will who conducted most of the field work. We did some of it together in Nigeria, so he will know a lot more than I do actually about certain aspects. So we can talk more about some of that afterwards. So essentially, this paper looks at Traumadol in Lagos, the market for Traumadol in Lagos, and what I wanted to say first before I start, this is actually part of a wider project, which is called, at the moment, The Hidden Narratives of Illicit Livelihoods in West Africa, which we run together with colleagues at IFRA. And this project doesn't just look at drugs, but it looks at other what we call ambiguous or legally ambiguous activities, and we are trying to understand narratives, local narratives about these legally ambiguous activities. And the trade in Traumadol is one of these activities that is sort of in a space that's legally not too clear. The other one that we look at is the transport of migrants. So we're not looking actually at how those things are done together, so not at if there's some involvement of migrant transporters in the Traumadol trade, but looking at this separately, one aspect in Niger, the other one in Nigeria. And the idea really of looking at these illicit livelihoods, as we call them, is that they're neither legal nor illegal, but they're in the process of being criminalized or securitized. And that's why we are interested in that. So we're interested in this process of how their status changes and how people think about those activities. So I think there's quite a lot of similarities to what Maxime and what Anike have talked about as well. And the framework that we use is based on work by academics such as Van Schendel and Abraham, who sort of distinguish between state definitions of what's legal and illegal, and social definitions of what's licit and illicit, and the tensions that exist between those things. And I think that speaks to also what the other presenters have talked to. And the question that we try to answer, or that we try to struggle with rather, and I think I'm still struggling with this, and might be nice to talk about that afterwards as well, if there is anything like something called a moral economy of Traumadol in Lagos. And our short answer to this, sort of moral economy, basically based on the work of James Scott and others that sort of that assume that economic exchanges are not just about economic rationales, but there are also some moral or some notions of justice or moral dimensions to them as well. And so the interesting thing about Traumadol, obviously, the one that we are dealing with, this is considered illegal, illegitimate by the state, but it's still a very flourishing trade. So Traumadol is actually the second most widely used illegal drug in Nigeria after cannabis. So we're trying to look at these kind of blurred lines between the legal, illegal, and the licit and the illicit, essentially. And when we look at the moral economy, I'll come to that at the end of the presentation more explicitly. We found there isn't anything similar to what you have in the work of James Scott and Thompson and others, but it's important to look at these moral dimensions because they help you to understand the meanings of substances such as Traumadol and other activities, and not necessarily drugs, and the politics that's surrounds them, basically, or that's part of them. In terms of research in this field on Traumadol, this is a very topical issue, but it's actually not very well researched substance. So most of what we have is a kind of policy or gray literature on it that is flourishing, but it's not really based on much, how do you say that, not on very strong sources or data. So it's often based on law enforcement data, like Corentin already said at the beginning. Much of the work on drugs is based on that policing arrest data, and then inferences are made on how big or how these markets basically function, and also on concepts. One of them that's quite prevalent to the issues that we study in our project is organized crime, sort of as a tool to understand those things, but often to actually further misrepresent those issues. So we are trying to challenge some of those ideas on these state-driven data and concepts about Traumadol, and try to find what people that are actually involved in selling and using those substances think about these substances and how legitimate it is in their eyes. And we do that by trying to avoid state sources and looking at in-depth interviews, so similar to the other interviews, other presentations here, as well as observation of market insiders. We did that mostly in Lagos, a particular part of Lagos, on Lagos Island. commercial and residential areas of Lagos Island, where we talk to people involved in the trade. So these are people selling, marketeers, but also people involved in the import of Traumadol, some of it legal imports. So these are qualified or licensed traders, but most of them are illicit or illegal traders, sometimes depicted as organized criminals or such. But anyway, this is the group of people we talk to, as well as regulators. Just to give you one little thing, Traumadol, because I get that question many times, it's a synthetic opioid painkiller. It has similar effects to morphine, but it's much less pharmacologically, much less powerful, basically. But the pharmacological, how do you call that, power of drugs is not the main thing that we're actually interested here and in much of our work. Anyway, what I want to do now, because I'm sure I'm already behind schedule, is just look briefly at sort of dominant views about Traumadol, or how this became an issue in Nigeria over the last 10, 15 years, and then contrast that a little bit to what we found when we did our interview. So Traumadol is actually quite an old substance, invented or created in the 1960s, on the market in the 1970s. So some of the traders we talked to could still remember these kind of early types of Traumadol, but it only really became an issue over the last 7, 8 years in West Africa or in policy circles. And in many ways, it was often linked to what was happening in North America at the same time, because in North America, you might have heard that there is a kind of opioid crisis. It's of different types of opioids, fentanyl, for example, which is a much more pharmacologically more powerful substance. But these crises are linked in policy discourse. So the UNODC's World Drug Report of 2020, for example, mentions the situation in West Africa at the same time as the one in North Africa as the global opioid crisis that needs to be tackled. I asked them about, why they put these things together, and they actually just said they didn't know where to put Traumadol in their report, so they just put it together with the American section. But essentially, these are very different types of uses, drugs, and so on. But this created a sort of focus on the so-called forgotten opioid crisis in West Africa, to some degree, this global concern. In Nigeria, what we found, it was had a very different dimension. There were these influences of these international sort of narratives or discourses on the opioid crisis, but there was strong concern, especially in 2018, on a crisis of among young people and women overusing opiates. Not actually Traumadol, but a related substance called codeine. So I don't know if anyone saw that. There was a little documentary published by the BBC called Sweet Sweet Codeine in 2018, which sort of portrayed a large number of young people, especially in northern cities such as Kano, overusing codeine, people going mad, having to go for drug treatment, and a lot of women supposedly using those substances. If you actually look at the household survey of drug use in Nigeria, you would actually find that most Traumadol is actually used in the southwest of Nigeria. But anyway, these dominant views at the time that created a kind of moral panic in 2018 sort of focused on the north, young people, and especially women, young women, as the major people threatened by Traumadol. The UN and sort of more international actors and law enforcers domestically, like the NDLEA, has also made quite explicit links between Traumadol and organized crime. That was already before 2018. And they have sort of argued that, that as organized criminal groups that have realized that things like cocaine and heroin are not as profitable, and they have moved into Traumadol because it's much more profitable to trade and much easier probably to trade in these pharmaceutical substances. So they have talked about transnational organized crime organization trading this from India, which is really the major source country for most generic drugs in Nigeria, not just Traumadol. And then sort of they blamed that on organized crime groups, and also made the link to Boko Haram, that supposedly Boko Haram is one of the major consumers as well as traders, or they have trade networks in the tramadol trade. Any of those claims really is very rarely supported with any evidence, and can be just considered very dubious, but they have become important in policy discourses, these links of tramadol trade to organized crime and Boko Haram. Essentially what happened then in terms of policy responses, and that's mostly in response to that 2018 moral panic on codeine, tramadol, especially the higher dosages above 100 gram, became illegal. And sort of the government started to crack down and destroy loads of those tramadol preparations that were in the market at that point. Has received less policy attention since then. So what did we find though when we actually spoke to those people involved in the tramadol trade? Tramadol is still widely available in Nigeria after 2018. Most of the research was done in 2019 and 2020. And we spoke to traders in Lagos as well as importers and regulators, and there was quite, and trying to find out about these moral narratives or moral understandings of tramadol. So there was quite a clear view basically of what type of tramadol was acceptable and what type of tramadol use wasn't acceptable about our traders. You know, the acceptable use was for killing pain in a medical kind of way, sort of to cure medical problems. Much of the tramadol nowadays is still used in sort of medical settings like hospitals, and pharmacists also prescribe tramadol, although a bit less after 2018. So that medical kind of use of tramadol was very, very accepted. And the people that we talked to, often they were called tramadol doctors actually, and sort of were very clear that this, you know, you would use tramadol for this and that kind of medical condition. What you were not supposedly to sell tramadol for or prescribe tramadol for was for drug use, as in using drugs for recreational purposes or getting high. You know, some young people using it to party more and things like that. Although that was actually was still done anyway. But there was a clear distinction between acceptable medical use and unacceptable non-medical use, essentially. In reality, to be honest, most of the tramadol was used or sold neither for medical use in the traditional sense or recreational use, but for work-related use. So tramadol was used to work harder, essentially, and there were a lot of different types of tramadol that would be used for this and that type of use. And you could say that maybe this tramadol use for work, in a way, is also medical or kind of pain-relieving type of use, because after all, these users would be involved, many of them, some of them sex workers or in the building construction trade, in very in jobs that were very tough on them. So again, anyway, also one thing that should be mentioned is that 5 minutes, okay, almost done anyway. Thanks a lot. That we have a context of the rise in self-medication in Nigeria and many other West African countries. So the fact that these substances like tramadol were not actually sold through pharmacies is nothing exceptional, because most of those substances were actually sold outside the legal or medical sphere. So it's actually easier to get it outside anyway, but that's a different story. The other thing that we also found when we talked to those traders is that tramadol provided a livelihood, a very important livelihood for those traders. They always argued, maybe partly because they spoke to us, that there were very few alternatives. So they tried to justify their work of selling tramadol. And still those tramadol doctors, if you were to compare them to some of the other actors in the pharmaceutical market that I've been talking to over the past few years, they were very much on the margins of the pharmaceutical market, because tramadol was not the most respected drug. And so it was one way to enter the pharmaceutical market, but probably not one part to really flourish in pharmaceuticals. And the other thing that we also found very interesting is that there was this kind of ambiguous nature of tramadol, which probably is not only specific to tramadol, but any drugs, legal and illegal drugs, illegal and sometimes legal drugs as well, this was kind of accepted even among law enforcers who found that, you know, a drug that at the same time can heal and harm, they were not really sure where to place that. So there was a lot of uncertainty among law enforcers, for example, and self about what the role of tramadol was. Was it just harmful or was it healing as well? So the last point is just about this moral economy thing. You know, was there a moral economy of tramadol? I still don't know, to be honest. But in some ways, we found that these narratives that we found on the just sale of tramadol for medical purposes, not for recreational purposes as a drug to get high, as well as these ideas about tramadol being a legitimate livelihood for people, sort of these sort of showed some kind of contours of a moral or different moral economy on tramadol and drugs. But in some ways, obviously, there wasn't anything like in the sense of what James Scott and others have found in the context of the moral economy of the peasant. These discussions on or narratives on tramadol were very incoherent, often very divided, and there was a lot of competition in these pharmaceutical markets and a lot of, how do you say that, blaming each other on who was at the root of whatever drug problem. So there was a lot of that incoherence essentially, and also similar to what we heard in the other two presentations, there wasn't really too much contestation of the official view on tramadol. So these kind of views that medical use of tramadol is acceptable sounds very similar actually to what you had in these official statements about tramadol below 100 milligrams, that's okay, but above, that's not okay. So that confirms what Corentin and others have said. But it still helped us to understand these drugs, these contested substances better, and also the politics around it. And I'm sure Ini and I, we can sort of answer any questions about any more details you want to know afterwards.
Thank you again. Thanks a lot for that. Well, I guess now comes the time of Q&As. Would you like to raise your hands and maybe I can take a couple of questions? Anyone? I had a quick question for Corentin. Actually, he's gone for 20 minutes. There you go. Mr. Bidon Pascal, please go.
All right. Thank you for this opportunity. I don't know if you can hear me clearly. All right. Thank you. Actually, this is not a question. I just want to comment on few speakers because I studied the English language at the University of Lagos, where I obtained my master's degree. So drugs or abuse is not really my discipline, but when I saw the topic, I'm highly interested to know more about it. And then I must really commend our doctors that have spoken based on this particular topic, because I really gather a lot of information from this presentation. Where I live here, drug is not like the social aspect of drug abuse is not really far-fetched. You can easily see it on the street. There's a stone throw where it's been sold there. I don't know if this is actually what I should be saying, but because it's particular about this topic, so I have to say. So from what the speakers have said, I did not really gather a lot of information from your first speaker, but from Maxine, where he said drug security comes from building of economy of violence. Smoke houses are really important in social order. Smoke houses negotiate to maintain social order, particularly police and some other agencies. And then the religious aspects where charms is used for protection against their maybe enemy or whatsoever in order to deal the product. So all these things, and also from Van Dyke Anije, where she spoke about the mental aspect of the mental health aspect of it, sort of the consequences in relationships, since they can't fund their relationship anymore, whereby it leads to stealing, to associate with new people, new acquaintances, and then from Ghana, where Traumadol makes its user active, provide for livelihood, and it's rampant since 2018, 2019. All these things that, this information that I've heard here, it's not far-fetched here, it's real, absolutely real. Because I live here in Lagos, and then I know what everything that the research and the presentation is talking about is absolutely the truth. I just want to commend and then appreciate all the speakers, because why? Because I hear what is happening here on the streets, right in front of me. So I thank all the speakers for doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, very nice comments. Anyone would like to answer, or should I ask someone else to ask a question maybe? Please.
No, well, thank you for your comments, but I actually wanted to ask a question to Maxime, if that's okay. Yeah, because I have been to Abidjan as well during my master's, because I did research in Boaké, and I was very interested actually in, just from observations, I didn't do any study, but in the relation between drugs and the transport system. And I wonder, because I think in your article you described that many people who make money from drugs also make money from the transport system. But I was thinking, because I have used these bacas myself, and if you see how the system works and the kind of energy that people put in it, I felt that, you know, in a way also these drugs, they also have a role in sort of keeping the system going. And I wondered how the people you met reflected on that. Like, what is the role of drugs in sort of, you know, making this transport system work, and maybe other things as well?
Yes, that's definitely drug use that is very common indeed in this economy of transport within the BACA system. Definitely in the paper we studied that more in the from a political economy understanding of how the social world of drugs in Abobo is intermingled with the social world of transport. Because basically Abobo is like a hub of repairmen and owners of Baka, which actually have a lot of link with Boaké. That's a side note. And in our paper, or in our research, what we saw is that in the similar way as you described for the workers in Baka who are using these drugs to give them energy, etc. And I think that Gernot also in his research in Nigeria mentioned that too, about how like these drugs can be used to, you know, enhance your performance at work, etc. Here we saw that for the in the little gangs that we call bon-i. In the bon-i, the drugs, when you are launching an attack against opponents, to do an attack to rob people, etc., etc. These drugs have a very important role, and in the paper we describe that how it is used. Also, these drugs are very important when you want to be included in the bon-i, so these little gangs. But definitely it's actually an aspect that I didn't even sort of to write about in the paper. It's a good point.
Can I add something? Yeah, I think, Annika, that's a very nice sort of link, between transport and drugs. I think there's so many examples. I'm maybe not necessarily our papers. I can think of cut in East Africa as well, how that is used in places like Kenya or in Somalia, in the transport industry, how essential that is. And I don't think many people have actually looked at it. So maybe that's another special issue about drugs and transport or something like that. That we could look at. I'm also thinking about the work of Mark Hunter in South Africa, who actually works on young people, I think, on using Xanax or Mandrugs to actually enhance their performance in school settings. I think you would, maybe we are just looking at illegal substances, but if you would broaden this out to legal substance, if you think about coffee, tea, or all kinds of sort of pharmaceutical substances that you're used to work harder in school, I think you would find a lot of that in Nigeria as well. Or there's a lot of pressure on students to actually perform, and these drugs are kind of seen as a way to have that extra performance. Yeah, so I think that's something, but I don't think there's too many people working on this yet. So yeah, maybe something for the future.
And if you hand is
yeah, no, just a quick reaction on what Gernot said, that that was also narrative. I was in Chad as well, and there's a lot of motor taxis, and that people also said, oh, they all use Traumadol. You have to look at their eyes. If they're red, you shouldn't, get on their. But I think it's very interesting to, because I feel in some places, and as you said, we do it maybe with coffee and other things as well, but that it can be so integrated in the system that you start thinking what would happen if the drugs weren't there anymore. Like, would people still be able to do the same jobs or the same kind of work, or, what kind of, but anyway, that's just an addition.
Could I also suggest, I don't know if Ini wanted to add something to any of those things we have discussed, or maybe to what I said as well.
Thank you, Gernot. I think you covered everything brilliantly and coherently. I don't think I have much to say anything you already said in your presentation. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question about whether or not you've taught this material before in England or Netherlands, or where you're based right now? Have you taught this before?
You mean taught to students? Or?
To students, see how they react to this concept of political economy linked to drugs, basically. I'm asking because I might teach something on drugs in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I think these drug units are very popular, or drug modules are very popular in the UK, at least. Too popular, too many students want to, maybe there, but I think, yeah, because you assume students have a kind of, how would you say that, liberal view of drugs. But so I think it is quite well received, I think. But I think for me as a drug researcher, you often have to be very careful not to, how do you say that, underplay the risks and the dangers from drugs which really exist as well. So it's not like, Traumadol is all good. I advise everyone who wants to work hard to use it. There's obvious risks with any substance. And I think even the most, how you call that, reform-minded and liberal-minded NGOs or whatever that push for policy reform would still acknowledge, that there's dangers and risks. So I think that's one thing that I need to say always about, the fact that we are saying that Traumadol is used for those kind of legitimate purposes in the eyes of people selling it doesn't mean that there's real risks from using it, obviously, as there's for many other things. Anyway.
No, I was asking a question because I've taught stuff about the political economy of this or the political economy of that. I never linked it with drugs, basically. And I wondered what the result was, I suppose, but, thank you. Yeah. Joe, please.
I can hear you.
Yes. Mr. Olusoji, you're muted.
Yes, good evening. Hello, everyone.
Good. Hello.
Yes, I live in Lagos, and so I can connect with some of the, I live in the mainland, then I can connect with the presentation, the opium, the Traumadol. Very nice presentation for every presenter. Very insightful. Thank you. Now, my only perspective is that I want to just, if any of the presenter can pick it up, like drug use in Nigeria and other, you mentioned other in North Africa and I think in South America. So is there a pattern? Is it a form of escapism? Are we looking at that? Because there is a study, there is a report I read trying to depict that in Nigeria, for instance, the youth are disillusioned. They are disconnected from the government. So some of them, two things they do is either they embrace Pentecostalism to the extreme, or Islamism to the extreme, or they take to drug. This is you to just escape the reality on ground, nothing inspiring for them. So I'm thinking of looking at the global political economy system, which affects the local economy itself and the youth itself not having something functional to do and trying to look for escape just to find and just get high, then later you come back to yourself. I don't know if you have this political economy explanation to these, that, okay, people are doing that one to escape. And people have been trying to see why some Nigerians are more into Pentecostal churches these days in terms of economic difficulties. And what about Islamic radicalism from insurgency to banditry? Banditry is basically economic, trying to collect money after kidnapping. So I'm looking at that drug use as a form of political economy dimension. I don't know if there is any connection between that. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone like to answer this? Ini, please, you go.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that one. I'm thinking. I mean, I'll be relying on Gennett here to come in if I misspeak in any way, or if I'm not coherent enough. I think with regard to your question, it's really, especially when you're thinking about political economy, or rather political economies of different subjects, it can end up being quite nebulous as a, and we were essentially trying to focus on just one of several themes of multiple themes that we thought one could possibly explore when it comes to specifically Traumadol in Nigeria. And in fact, that's why we focused only on Lagos as opposed to looking at say Kano or even northern Nigeria on a broader scale, because we recognize that there's a lot of nuance to the discourse, not just within Africa when it comes to drugs or illicit economies, but even within the Nigerian context. So we thought, why don't we narrow this down as finely as we possibly can? And so we thought, okay, let's just focus on Lagos. And that's why we focused just on Lagos. And of course, we thought, okay, let's look at our research expertise. And again, it's not, I stand to be corrected on this, he's not a religion expert, unless he tells me that he's not into Christian Pentecostalism or Islam. And so we thought, okay, let's look at this from a criminological perspective, essentially, of course, with an exploration of how different actors in Nigeria conceive of Traumadol use from a moral perspective. And if you read our contribution to the special issue, you see that there's a part where, for example, we make a reference to the use and grace of Traumadol, where we explore this using the lyrics of Olamide, for example. There's Olamide and Naira Marley, where we sort of touch on how, you know, the youth think about Traumadol use and, you know, the youth gravitation, for lack of a better word, towards drug use, by exploring some of the lyrics of Olamide and Naira Marley and things like that. Or we try not to look at it from a religious, or, you know, in terms of, oh, you know, this is why this is connected to Islamic radicalism or Christian Pentecostalism, because that would have just meant going off on another tangential trajectory. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Can I just add? So I totally agree with what Ini said. I think we just didn't focus on it. Maybe the one thing that, you know, the title of the paper is Opioid of the People, which was taken probably with some reference to Karl Marx, Opium of the People, religion being the opium of the people. So maybe that got this whole thing confused, but I think that was not the intention. I also have to say that we were not actually allowed to speak to drug users for ethical reasons. So we can't really say about, you know, why people use drugs. I guess there's many different reasons why some people use drugs. Escapism, maybe that's one, but for another person could be totally different, or could be many for one. I think maybe Anniki's work is actually probably the one of those papers that looked most at why, or at people using drugs. And I think most other people were more involved in how drugs are perceived by outsiders or traders. So anyway, that's what I wanted to add here, I think.
Anyone else? Any other questions you may have?
Maybe I just add a question for, I'm very sorry, I forgot how we pronounce your name, Ange, sorry. It's all right. You know, in your paper, you talked about the question of moral agency, the limit of moral agency, and, you know, I quickly read your paper. Maybe I wanted you to explain what you meant by that, in terms of, like, to, you know, I got the chance also to read the Garnot and Corentin introduction, and they are discussing you know, the tensions around the term moral economy, because at the beginning, if I'm not mistaken, the special issue was supposed to be around the concept of moral economy, and then it became. So I wanted to see, you know, what you add to the conversation about this question of moral agency. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think why we came into this discussion more related to moral agency, moral experience, is because the moral economy concept, indeed, also for us, didn't really work, in the sense that, well, we mainly looked at the work of Philippe Bourgois, who writes about the moral economy among drug users really much in the community. So he basically hung out with a group of people who use drugs and tried to understand the kind of value they attach to certain things that might seem, you know, sort of repulsive, maybe even in the eyes of others, or criminal, or ununderstandable. But he used the word moral economy to sort of show how within this group, it can actually become values that work between people. But we didn't have access to that kind of interactions. So then we turned to the work of moral anthropologists, which, I mean, of course, if you use the word moral too many times, it becomes moral. But anyway, so they make sort of this distinction between agency or experience and moral agency, moral experience. That part of agency or that part of experience that is sort of shaped in relation to ideas, local ideas about what it means to be a good person and your ability to live up to that ideal. So, for example, if one of our interviewees, well, one of the interviewers in the project, when he says that, okay, I'm not able to found a family, that says something both about what he defines as good and also about his idea about whether he can live up to that or not. So I think in that sense, moral agency is an interesting concept because it sort of shows how people analyze their own capacity to live a life that they would want to live in relation to what they define as a good life. So yeah, I think in our case, that was a sort of fitting concept because we talked to, the research project, they talk to individuals. So yeah, but of course, these concepts are also negotiated between people, and it would be very interesting to know more about that as well. But yeah, so far we have to still design a new research project, I think.
Thank you.
I hope that makes it clear. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting.
Can I add as well? So I because I was with Corentin, we were involved in the evolution of your articles as well, actually. So we found both these papers very exciting, much more than sort of my input on this. I think how you are thinking about this idea of moral economy, how it started, I think in some of the papers, and then it sort of disappeared, and then it was taken over by other ideas on the moral landscapes or moral agency. And I think, Maxime, you had one as well that might be worth highlighting. I think you mentioned that in your presentation. Is it called moral coercive community or something like that? So I wonder how this sort of fits into that, and how it links maybe to Aniche's concept.
Yeah, when you actually you get back to us with the first version of the paper, we tried to thought about this, and we really like the idea of collusive transaction by Johanna Siméon that we used to conclude the paper. This idea that basically legitimacy is built from below. And is not necessarily actually a moral. There is more aspects to this conversation about drugs, but it's something that should be linked to material and social interactions, social negotiations. The concept of a moral coercive community is more to think how the society, the local society, the local community tries to maintain order despite these tensions around smoke houses. Smoke houses are just part of the whole of the bigger picture. But yeah, it's from Laurent Fourchard, and actually it's research that was part done in Nigeria and South Africa by him on vigilantism. Yeah, I think although I read also research that challenged the concept of community, because the concept of community is also problematic. This idea that there is some kind of homogeneous local society. So I think that as I'm also working on trying to write a book about my thesis, I'm thinking about, challenging the concept of community, this idea that there is this local cocoon or which is, but also in the paper, beyond the concept of community, we show that there is, tensions and negotiation within the local society. So it's not, something, we don't define community as something positive or negative per se, or by definition. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thanks. Yeah.
Would anyone like to ask a last question, maybe, since we are, you can see the conversation is your last one?
Can I ask another one? I don't know if Ayotunde wanted to ask or no. The question, because, this special issue started out with the idea that we are looking at drugs from below to some degree, not using state sources and all that kind of stuff, like Corentin said. And we did struggle quite a bit with INI, actually, in our ethics review. So ethics, is one kind of thing. And for people that don't study drugs, it's something that you probably think it's almost unresearchable because it's hidden, it's illegal. And I mean, I just wonder if the other presenters and maybe also INI could reflect on how what the ethical challenges really were of conducting this kind of research. Was it the ones that you dealt with during your ethics review, or was it completely different ones? Our ethics review, just to mention, took, I think, almost 9 months to get through. And what we dealt with in that had nothing to do with what we actually dealt with on the ground. But anyway, INI would be able to know. I don't know if you want to reflect on that. If not, then don't worry. So that's to Maxime, Anike, and INI. And
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go in, yeah.
Sorry again. I totally agree with you. I mean, I think the quite laborious process we went through with gaining ethical approval for the fieldwork aspect of the project definitely gave us a lot to think about. And it also helped as well in just keeping us sort of, how do you say, grounded and circumspect in terms of just thinking about how we engaged with the fieldwork, with the fieldwork itself and also the fieldwork participants. But then there were also several aspects to it that we did not anticipate or that maybe we could have anticipated prior to the beginning of the fieldwork phase of the project. And I think it was only when, at least for me, and I suspect it was probably the same for Guinness, it was only when I was on the grind that I realized how important it is to be constantly just reflect on how I wanted to conduct the field work, essentially, because there's always that tendency or the temptation rather to go in different, be pulled in different directions, essentially, especially when you're treating a subject that's quote unquote exciting. And also if you feel a sort of attachment of one sort of the other to the topic or to the geographical location where you're conducting research, that kind of thing, then there's going to be that temptation to do a bunch of different things. And that's where I find sticking to some of these ethical guidelines really comes in, can really come in handy. And also, it might seem limiting, but it also helps as well in terms of just, you know, making sure that the work has a high standard of just ethicality, essentially, which I believe is why we chose to not interview drug users, essentially, because we could have done that. That would probably have made it a bit more more attractive or exciting. But we thought if you have questions about the ethicality of something, then maybe, and if you can't answer that clearly, then maybe it's better to just steer clear of that. So I believe that was why we thought, okay, let's just draw these parameters around sort of what we're doing, the questions we're asking, and more importantly, who we're asking these questions. And so those are just some of the things I think guided us, and not just individually, but collectively, as we were thinking about how to frame the field work, and also when we were just thinking about how to go about it.
Well, on my part, while Felix didn't have ethical review in Ivory Coast, I had one. The thing is that for me, the dimension of drugs and smokehouses kind of popped up during the field research. So it was not something that I really anticipated during the ethics review, in the ethics review. I did not do interviews with drug users per se. I interviewed people who happen to sometimes use drugs or have been involved in the dealing and commerce of drugs. But one of the most important things I learned from doing the ethical review is the idea that you need to be, as a researcher, to be aware that of the consequences of you researching participants, you know, especially with regard to violence, to the use of violence. So for me and also Felix, from the get-go, we really decided to avoid what we defined as social situation that could lead to be witness, or even we could be a factor that increase violence. I'll give you a concrete example. You know, for example, we were invited many times to do round in the neighborhood at night with vigilante committees, and we always refused because we thought that our presence could be detrimental, you know, to the community. And so that's one of the examples. But to be honest, while an ethics review is, as Ini said, is really interested to reflect before the field about the challenges of research, the respect of participants, etc. Some things pop up in the field that you cannot manage everything. You know, I don't know if it's in this paper, but you know, I witnessed violence in a police station, and as I was just speaking with policemen, and it's something that, you know, you cannot really like foresee when you are doing ethnographic research. So I think that there is good things about the ethical review board for sure, but also there is things that by definition, when you work from below, there is things you cannot really always foresee when you do research.
Yeah, so for me, I wasn't involved in that part of the project, this research project. So, but I know they applied to the Burkinabe board of, how do you say it? Research ethics for health research. And of course, the methodology was a bit different because they didn't go to the places where the people were, but somehow made people come to them. So the researchers themselves didn't really go into the community, which of course, yeah, there's different things to say for and against it, but at least I think maybe it worked to not expose people in their communities. So, but for more questions, I would have to refer you to Roger. Just maybe a reflection from my own research, which was with mental health patients actually, who I met at the psychiatric ward. I had many ethical hurdles to cross before I got permission, even though it didn't take too long. It wasn't too strict of a process. And I got permission from the Burkinabe Board of Ethics, but it also made me realize that thinking too much about ethics and sort of trying to live up to all these rules can also really restrict research, which is good. But at the same time, when I hear that you, for example, did not include the people who use drugs in your research for that reason, I sometimes wonder, like, how, yeah, what does that mean? Like, is it, yeah, I know we have to be very careful and it's very important. And at the same time, I also heard people say, yeah, I did research on interviewed like mental health workers because I cannot interview the patients because it's too sensitive. But then a very important perspective, of course, isn't heard. So, and I mean, yeah, I have lots of reflections about ethics in relation to my own research, but yeah, I just wonder, you know, how we should deal with this dilemma, because I think it's a very important reflection and a very difficult one as well.
Well, if I may, I think you're totally right. In the UK, they have lengthy processes to control, and for good reasons sometimes, what we're doing. Normally, I mean, Nigeria now, I was based in the UK before, so I've got to mention. And clearly there's a tendency to, you know, to prevent any problem from happening by, you know, just restricting as much as possible what we can do. I've never worked on drugs, I've never worked on mental health issues, but still I was asked to anonymize people's names, even if I was interviewing them about a distant past, which doesn't make much sense when you think about it. I understand why it can be good for a lot of different subjects, but I can see how, I can understand your question really. Yes, yes, yeah. Gerard, you want to say something, maybe to conclude our conversation today?
Yeah, anyway, I just a little bit to add what they said. I think for us, the problem was the name of the project as well. We had contentious words in our project title. One was organized crime initially. No, actually one was hidden. It was called the hidden narratives of transnational organized crime in West Africa. So we have hidden in there, which is already something, you know, you can't see, so it must be studying something dodgy. And then it's organized crime, which they made them think about our ethics board, about Al Capones and all those people. But these are just small scale traders, basically. They're not very threatening. I was more scared of talking to the police, like in Maxime's example. That's where the violence happens. And then there were some sort of prejudices about doing this in West Africa, obviously, in the institution where we applied, I think, as well. But anyway, so I think you learn lessons for the next ethics review, which we did very differently then, and it was much shorter.
Yeah, just to one last thing. I think what Ini said is very important, that, you know, ethics, okay, you have the ethics review and you have the rules, but it really is something you negotiate on a day-to-day, you think about on a day-to-day basis when you do research. And I think that's the most important thing, actually, that you should always, you know, keep doing it. And complying by the rules doesn't mean that you're an ethical researcher. So I think it's very important to, you know, very good point that he made. So I just wanted to repeat it.
So I think that's a very nice concluding remark as well. Maybe I just wanted to say thanks for inviting us, Vincent, and to hosting us, and for everyone who was here. And if anyone is interested in any of our work, I think the papers were posted in the chat. So if you haven't already, download them there, because you have to pay for them online. But here they are free. But if you can't get them from here, then just send us an email, and we're happy to forward this. I wanted to officially hand over that special issue to Vincent now, but it doesn't really work virtually. So I'll bring them to Nigeria in a couple of weeks. But thank you very much, everyone. Anyway.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I to remind you that the chat was your papers were recorded, so they should be on our website next week, I suppose. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.